Hello everyone, welcome. Today we'll be exploring some flavor compounds commonly found in white wine. And if you're joining us with a tasting kit, then you'll be able to experience what those flavors are actually like in some wine samples. My name is Siets Wijma. I have a company called The Art of Tasting. I run classes like these. I create tasting kits and with the aim of helping people become better at tasting. I have a master in sensory science, and sensory science is the study of flavor perception. So it's an academic study focusing on the senses of smell and taste. I have a level 4 diploma in wines from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and I'm also an advanced Cicerone. And advanced Cicerone is basically the beer equivalent of a sommelier. So I know a thing or two about beer as well. If you're joining us with your tasting kit, then I'll give some quick setup instructions. You're going to need 3 identical glasses. I'm traveling at the moment, so I don't have access to nice wine glasses, unfortunately. So I'm using some plastic cups. As long as you have 3 identical cups, we'll start with pouring the reference wine into one of the cups, followed by samples number 1 and 2. You can just empty the entire contents of your sample into the glass. So just to rehearse, 1 and 2 will go into your glass as well. And then in the meantime, I'll explain you about the science of white wine and why some flavors are noticeable in white wines. And if you look at what the chemical background is of the aroma of a white wine, it looks something like this. And basically, this is a list of chemical compounds or aromatic molecules that determine the aroma of wine. And you see hundreds of them. Don't bother about trying to remember or recognize any of these aromatic compounds. It's more to illustrate the principle. And out of these hundreds of different compounds, usually a couple of dozen that determine the flavor of wine. And if you would have access to all these chemicals and put them together in exactly the right quantities, you'd have a precise replication of the aroma of white wine, so what comes out of that glass. And this is a principle that applies to every smell in our daily life. So be it the smell of tea, be it the smell of lavender or coffee or green bell pepper, it always consists of hundreds of different aroma compounds. And not all of these matter. So that means that the majority is present in such a low concentration that they are not picked up by humans. They don't contribute to the smell. So it's only a handful, say 10 to 20, that indeed contribute to the character of that smell. Importantly, sometimes when we compare the two aromas, we see that one or more of those aroma compounds, such as highlighted in this example, is the same. And this is the scientific principle behind why we associate one smell with the next. Okay, this is why your coffee can smell of chocolate, and this is why your white wine can smell of a green bell pepper. It means that one or more of those aromatic compounds are identical between the two types of smell. Today, we're going to look at 10 such examples. So 10 molecules that are found in both in wine and also in other products or sources in nature, and that makes us associate wine aroma with other things. The way that these samples are prepared, the reference glass in front of you is a white wine without any addition. And in number 1, I've pipetted a small quantity of that aroma molecule into these wines. These are all samples that are safe to smell and to taste because these are the molecules that exist in wine. I've also added them at a quantity that you would expect to find them in wines. So please go ahead and smell sample number 1. And what you'll notice if you compare it with the reference glass, there's one aroma that's unique. And that is the aroma of green bell pepper. Because I've added this compound, which goes by a pretty long name, isobutyl methoxypyrazine. What this graph shows is descriptors of multiple wine tasters. I've asked 20 experienced wine tasters, give me some descriptors of this particular sample. And then about half of the people say, you know, that smells like a green bell pepper to me. But then the other half of the people, they would use less commonly used descriptors, such as green beans, because indeed, uncooked green beans, so unboiled green beans, have that same aroma compounds. It also contains the methoxypyrazine and releases the same smell. Earthy is another common descriptor, as well as tomato leaves. Now, when you're walking into a greenhouse and the smell that is present in that greenhouse when there's tomatoes grown, specifically the green parts of the tomato plant, indeed release that same smell. So even though these are less common descriptors, it doesn't mean that these people are wrong. It's just that people have different associations because they have different histories and which aromas they've been exposed to during their lives. That determines your association with a particular aroma molecule. This aroma appears in wine as a primary flavor, and primary aromas and flavors are those formed either in the grape itself or during fermentation. Other categories of aromas are secondary and tertiary aromas, which we'll explore later on. Specifically, this is an aroma that is present in the grape itself and doesn't need fermentation to be released. And that is quite unique. There's not that many white wine flavors and red wine flavors that behave like that. So it's present in its so-called free form. That means that it's unbound to any other components and doesn't need fermentation or aging to be noticeable. We're looking at a specific white grape variety here. We're looking at Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc produces noticeable levels of the green bell pepper flavor. And other varieties, such as Riesling or Chardonnay, they don't produce it at all. There's also some red grape varieties, notably Cabernet Sauvignon, that produce this flavor, as well as some more niche varieties such as Carmenère and Cabernet Franc that are also known for having higher levels of the green bell pepper compounds. In other words, this is highly a varietal flavor, so it's going to be dependent on the grape variety. We also know that there are some viticultural factors that determine the eventual level, notably temperature and sunlight exposure, where lower or cooler temperatures, as well as more shady conditions, stimulate the flavor and lead to higher levels of that flavor in the finished wine. That also means that if you're picking somewhat early, then you're going to get higher levels of the green bell pepper flavor, whereas a later harvest will result in lower levels. So various factors at play here. We also know that it tends to accumulate a little bit more in the skins of the grapes compared with the pulp, although it's also present in the pulp. So introducing some skin contact in white wines will result in slightly higher levels of that green bell pepper flavor. We know it exists in various styles of Sauvignon Blanc, most notably in the cooler regions, such as the Loire Valley in France, as well as in New Zealand, where some regions are notably cooler and result in higher levels of this flavor in wine. Also present on this slide are the compulsory steps of white winemaking in bold, which is pictured on the right here. Then in italics are the optional steps or the stylistic choices that the winemaker has. I'm not going to repeat all of these steps because I assume there's some prior knowledge, but I've highlighted the production step here, in this case, grape reception, that's most relevant for the particular flavor compound that we're discussing. There's also the icon here, the chemical structure. Then we have the detection threshold, which is the minimum quantity of that flavor that must be present in wine before it starts to give off a flavor at all. Now, and that is something that I'll dive into a little bit later on, what that exactly means. And we'll get more familiar with that unit of mg, which is short for nanogram. Let's move on to sample number 2 and give it a sniff as well. Also have a taste. It's a flavor that's quite noticeable on the palate. I'll give you a little bit of time before each sample to try to work out what the flavor might be. You can also pause the video here if you're watching this at a later stage. And then when you're ready, then just hit play again and I'll move on to the answer, which in this case is elderflower. So we're looking at an aroma and flavor of elderflower from a compound called 4-MMP, which is an abbreviation of a longer chemical name. While elderflower is the most commonly used descriptor, we're also looking at other interesting descriptors. Caturine, you wouldn't think that is at all related to elderflower, but indeed it contains similar compounds that can that have some aroma similarity. also box tree, as well as tropical fruit flavors like passion fruits and gooseberry. Not everyone knows what a gooseberry smells or tastes like, but this 4-MMP is an important part of that gooseberry flavor, was blackcurrant, specifically blackcurrant juice. So there's various ways that you can recognize this flavor, and it's also one of the key flavors of Sauvignon Blanc. So we're still in that Sauvignon Blanc territory. The way that this flavor develops, though, is quite different from the green bell pepper one. This is a flavor that's not present in the grapes as such, in such a way that it's immediately noticeable when you're tasting the grapes. This compound is bound to other structures in the grape, and in that bound form, it is not able to contribute to flavor, and that is only going to be noticeable during alcoholic fermentation. And we know that during alcoholic fermentation, yeast converts sugar into alcohol, but it does a whole bunch of other things, including releasing some aromas, and 4-MMP is one of them. So basically, yeast consumes, or it digests and metabolizes that 4-MMP while it's bound to something else. And then in that process, the 4-MMP is released and it starts to become noticeable. Once again, this is Sauvignon Blanc, but we have some control as a winemaker as to how much of this flavor is released, because we know that certain yeast strains are particularly efficient at carrying out that release. And if you're looking at any yeast selection of, say, a supplier like Lalamant, you typically have descriptors for the yeast in terms of how it behaves. And some yeasts are, for example, known to release high levels of esters, which are responsible for the fruity flavors in wine. But some yeasts are also able to release more 4-MMP. So these are yeast types that are specifically designed to ferment Sauvignon Blanc juice and then really bring forward those elderflower notes. This is a technique that we particularly associate with New World producers, such as those in New Zealand. Traditionally, you see ambient fermentation a bit more often in a more classic European regions where Sauvignon Blanc is grown. Of course, that's a broad generalization, but you do see that. And when fermentations happening by ambient yeast, you don't know how efficient those yeasts are at releasing 4-MMP. Typically, they're not as efficient as would be a commercial yeast strain. So you might get more subdued levels of 4-MMP. In terms of which viticultural factors determine this flavor, you're looking at basically an opposite pattern of the green bell pepper flavor. So when conditions are somewhat warmer and you get more sunlight, then 4-MMP develops to greater levels. So in that way, it's a bit opposite as the green bell pepper flavor. We're looking at a sulfur-containing compound here. If you take a look at the structural formula, there's an S there, which indicates the sulfur. And sulfur compounds don't exactly have a good name in the wine world in general, because they're often associated with a fault called reduction. And reduction is known to produce aromas such as boiled eggs, drains, and camembert, so undesirable flavor characters in wine. But what this shows is that some compounds that do contain sulfur are actually positives and contribute in a positive way to the flavor of wine. So some of those elderflower is a good example of that. Another example would be the aroma of coffee, which is also produced by a sulfur-containing compound, and it's an important flavor in red wines, specifically as a result of barrel aging. Okay, looking at the detection threshold again. So that unit of measurement, ng, is short for nanogram, and you might be more familiar with the unit milligram, and 1 milligram corresponds to roughly a sugar granule. So that's just to give you an idea how much it is. However, a nanogram is a millionth of a milligram. So really what we're looking at here is a millionth of a sugar granule. So these aromatic compounds are present in extremely small quantities, and nevertheless, they are able to produce such notable aromas and flavors. So that's pretty impressive. I've also converted that here to a volume percentage. So the wine that you're trying here has more or less 12% alcohol. But if you look at what that percentage is of 4-MMP present in that wine, it's 0.0, a lot of zeros, 3%. And that's very fascinating because it tells us that certain compounds we are very sensitive to as human beings, and other compounds such as alcohol, we're comparatively much less sensitive to. Going back to this slide over here, these are some analytical results of how much 4-MMP you might come across in several sources. Sancerre, Classic Sauvignon Blanc, Area and Loire Valley, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, as comparative levels. Please note that this is an average of several wine samples, so there's quite a lot of variation. Some of those Sauvignon Blancs might not show the compound very much, and others might show it in quite high levels, depending on how the wine is made and the grapes are grown. Some varieties don't show it at all. This is the level of the wine sample in front of you, so pretty representative what Sauvignon Blanc can do. And then here there's American IPA. So interestingly, this is a compound that you can also find in beers introduced by hops. Now, to wrap up, I'm going to ask you to pick up glasses 1 and 2. So that's the green bell pepper flavor and the 4-MMP elderflower flavor, and mix them together. So just blend in one wine with the next. You should have one empty glass now, one full glass, and try this wine. So these are two of your typical Sauvignon Blanc characters put together, and indeed, that very much smells like what a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc can do, for example. So while we're moving on, please get rid of those two samples. So we're going to move on. We should have 2 empty glasses or empty cups now, and find your vials containing number 3 and number 4, and then pour that into your cups as well. And then we're ready to discuss the next 2 flavors. Sample number 3 is the smell of banana. This is the smell of a compound called isoamyl acetate, which belongs to the class of esters. Esters are often responsible for the fruity flavors in wine, and isoamyl acetate is a classic example. More specifically, people would describe this as having the smell of an artificial banana, almost like an overripe banana, but also pear drops is mentioned. This is a specific type of sweets that are always flavored with this compound isoamyl acetate. And this is already discovered many years ago. We're looking at about 100 years ago when we already knew about this compound. It was immediately isolated. It's very easy to produce, to synthesize, and then the compound was also added straight away to different types of confectionery, including pear drops or Haribo sweets, for example, another example. And back in the day, people actually described that the flavor was very natural. So they didn't describe it as having a synthetic banana flavor in at all. And in order to understand that, you have to know that at the time, there was a different banana variety on the market called the Gros Michel, or also known as Big Mike. There was a problem with the Big Mike. He was susceptible to a disease called Panama disease. And Panama disease pretty much destroyed all the banana plantations worldwide. Pretty much how phylloxera devastated all the grapevines worldwide early on. Anyway, the solution is to use this new variety, Cavendish, which is pictured on the right, and that indeed has resistance to the Panama disease. So that was the solution. Everything was replaced with that new variety. People immediately noticed, however, that there was a flavor difference, and later that was confirmed because they analyzed the contents of isoamyl acetate, so the quantities of that aroma compound that is also present in sample number 3, and they found indeed much higher levels in the Gros Michel. And that tells us that whenever we're smelling this, basically it's the aroma of the banana variety of the past. Okay, that's some background on the flavor compound, but what is it doing in wine? We know in white wines that it's specifically generated by yeast. And not all yeast produce this. It's not necessarily related to any grape variety, but we know that specific fermentation techniques result in higher levels of this banana flavor. Crucially, you need to be fermenting at a low temperature. We know that white wines are fermented at about 12 to 22 degrees Celsius, but if you're fermenting at that 12-degree spot, you're getting the most banana flavor. Another important factor is juice clarity. If you carry out a filtration prior to fermentation, in other words, you're working with very clear juice, the yeast starts to produce a lot more of that banana flavor. And furthermore, you can also pick your yeast strain to have higher levels or higher tendencies to produce those esters of which isoamyl acetate belongs. That would be another way to get higher levels. It is also a compound found in red wines, most closely associated with the technique of carbonic maceration. This is a technique in red wines to make very fruit forward, youthful red wines, and it's also characterized by that banana flavor. Wines, these are also wines meant for early consumption. This is also a flavor compound that's not particularly stable in the bottle. And when I say stable, it means that if you keep your wine for about 1 year and you look at the levels of the banana flavor, it's only going to be about half of the original level. So this is a compound that rapidly degrades in the bottle. That is not true for every aroma compound. Some of them are much more stable. An example of a more stable flavor is the green bell pepper flavor from sample number 1. So even if you keep a wine bottle for 10 years, you would still have that same level of the green bell pepper flavor. But that's not at all the case with this banana flavor, which disappears during bottle aging. You see this sometimes in wines such as made from the Trebbiano grape varieties, and a good example of a grape that's often produced at very high yields. And when you produce grapes at high yields, they tend to be a bit more dilute or a bit more watery. And then using techniques such as fermenting at a low temperature, you can fill up that flavor, which would otherwise be quite neutral and bland. So this is usually reserved to the lower end, more affordable wines produced at high volumes. And you don't really see this flavor that much in the higher end examples of white wines. Detection threshold is somewhat higher, so that means that you need a lot more of this compound volume-wise compared with the previous two compounds before it starts to contribute to flavor. Let's move on to sample number 4. This is the smell of bruised apple, caused by a compound called acetaldehyde. Green apple being another flavor descriptor, in other words, Granny Smith apple, those are the famous green apples. Another interesting one is carved pumpkin. So if you slice a pumpkin in half and smell the inside, then the same compound of acetaldehyde is released. And there's some more narrow descriptors over here. Acetaldehyde has two distinct origins. And the first one I want to explain is that it is indeed produced during fermentation by yeast. And roughly speaking, yeast consumes sugar, turns it into acetaldehyde, and then turns acetaldehyde into alcohol. In other words, acetaldehyde is a compound which is an intermediate in the production of alcohol during fermentation. That tells us that when fermentation is not yet fully completed, a lot of the aroma in wine will be bruised apple. That can be intentional. Maybe the winemaker has indeed chosen to stop the fermentation early, but it can also be accidental. Maybe the fermentation was stuck because yeast stopped fermenting without the winemaker wanting that to happen. And for this fermentation reason, sometimes you do see it in styles such as Vinho Verde. This is a good example of a style that's often released very early after fermentation, and sometimes you do indeed see residual levels of acetaldehyde in such styles. That is especially historically so. Vinho Verde was bottled sometimes even when it was still fermenting, and you would also see a little bit of carbonation in those styles. Less so these days, but you can still come across this flavor in some Vinho Verde. We also know that there's a specific type of yeast called flor, which is always plays a role in the production of Fino sherries as well as Manzanilla sherries. And flor produces very high levels of acetaldehyde, about 3 times as much is a typical value that you would see in wines compared with the glass in front of you. Something I missed earlier. So the way that these samples are formulated, the detection threshold here of acetaldehyde is 15 milligrams per liter. I use a factor of 4, so that means that there's 60 milligrams per liter of acetaldehyde added to this particular wine. But Pinot Sherry can go much higher. It can even be 120, sometimes even 200 milligrams per liter. So even higher levels than this wine. And this is indeed a flavor that I very much associate with that particular style personally. But we haven't talked about the second origin of acetaldehyde, and that is of oxidation. So at any point when wine is exposed to oxygen, it could be maybe that your fermentation vessel was not completely filled. It could also be because your bottle of wine was open for too long. Then it will also start to develop higher levels of acetaldehyde. Before we move on, please pick up your 2 wine glasses, 3 and 4. That's the banana and the bruised apple. Mix them together. You can even pour a little bit back to create equal levels. And that very much what you're smelling here is the smell of a youthful white wine. So that is both of your isoamyl acetate fruity character produced by yeast combined with some acetaldehyde, which you might also see in younger wines. This is very much representative of a wine not intended for aging, but instead intended for early consumption. So empty your glasses 3 and 4, get rid of the banana and bruised apple flavors, pint 5 and 6, and pour them into the glasses that you've just freed up. So there should be some space there to pour the wines 5 and 6. While we get set up, I'm going to move to the next slide. Keep the speed high here. And sample number 5 is the aroma of bergamot. Bergamot is a specific type of orange, also known as the bitter orange, with a particularly fragrant skin. And that orange skin, or that orange peel, is often used in the flavor of Earl Grey tea. So if you don't exactly know what bergamot smells like, maybe this reminds you of Earl Grey instead. So have a sniff of this sample and decide what it smells like to you. In short, this flavor compound, linalool, has citrusy floral characters. So the citrusy being like mostly orange floral characters, sometimes described as rose or lavender-like. Also pretty noticeable on the palate, which we'll explore a little bit later on as well. This is a compound that belongs to the family of terpenes, and terpenes are typically responsible for the more floral characters in wine. There's only a subset of grape varieties that produce the compound linalool. The 2 most famous ones are the Gewürztraminer and Muscat that produce very high levels. But there are also varieties, including Torrontés, Viognier, and Riesling that produce this level, but to a slightly lower extent. And then you're also left with some varieties that don't produce the compound at all. And Chardonnay is an example of such a variety that doesn't produce linalool. This is a flavor, if you look at the grape berry, it is sort of evenly distributed between the pulp and the skin of the grape. That is quite interesting. A lot of aroma compounds tend to concentrate in the skins, but this is nicely evenly dispersed. And that also tells us that you don't need to use skin contact in white wines for that linalool flavor to be noticeable. When I think of wines where I come across this flavor, I always immediately think of Moscato d'Asti. That is indeed a style of Muscat, which is, well, obviously sparkling, but there's also no skin contact. And nevertheless, you still get this flavor. We're going to look at some another terpene as well, Other terpenes tend to be more located in the skins, but this is one that you get mostly, or well, in both the skin and the pulp. So the aromatic varieties that show this flavor. In terms of threshold, we're looking in the range of micrograms per liter here. Micrograms is in between milligrams and nanograms. So that means it's sort of medium in terms of how sensitive we are to this flavor. Not a particularly stable flavor in terms of bottle aging. So you do want to consume these wines earlier rather than later because you're going to lose some of the linalool over time. Let's move on to the next sample. Let's skip this for now. Okay. We're still in that realm of terpenes, and this particular compound is called rose oxide. And often when you look at the names of aroma compounds, they are named after where that was first identified. And we have identified this compound about in the 50s, that was first isolated from roses, and therefore they named it rose oxide. But later on, this was in the 90s, it was discovered that the same compound is also present in very high quantities in lychee fruits. And that remains the most common descriptor of this compound, although you do see other, well, floral characters as well. Honeysuckle, rose, Turkish delight, which is flavored with certain ingredients that also contain the compound rose oxide. Still a varietal character. And most famously, this is present in Gewürztraminer, to a lesser extent Muscat, but these are pretty much the only two varieties that have noticeable levels of rose oxide. So other varieties that might otherwise show terpenes won't really show that rose oxide character. We know that terpenes in general form in a greater extent if the grape is exposed to sunlight. So that's an interesting choice for the winemaker. If you prune away some green parts, for example, in the canopy and you leave the grapes more exposed, then they tend to develop higher levels of terpenes, especially so in the skins. And this is indeed also a flavor that is believed to concentrate a bit more in the skins. So if you're introducing a little bit of skin contact in your Gewürztraminer or your Muscat, you're getting higher levels of lychee, as well as a different compound called geraniol, which has even more of a rose aroma. So this is a compound that was for me one of the first compounds that I found out that exist in wine and also in other pages. So I've highlighted here an interesting statement from a Wikipedia page. Indeed, Gewürztraminer and lychee share the same aroma compounds. I remember reading about this about 10 years ago or something, and that was really mind-blowing for me because it was the first realization that there's some actual science behind many wine descriptors. And I enjoy that is still mentioned on this Wikipedia page today. It's referring to a scientific study carried out in the 90s. So it's already a longer time ago, but this remains very valuable information, and it's by now a classic study. On the left are some chemical results, some analytical results of this compound present in lychee. These are both fresh lychees as well as canned lychees. And then you see consistently high levels of rose oxide in that product. They've looked at a whole bunch of different Gewürztraminers as well from different sources, and they found high levels. But they also looked at Chardonnay, no rose oxide to be found. Then also Riesling, no rose oxide. I find the Riesling finding the most interesting because that grape otherwise can have terpenes such as linalool and geraniol, but it will never produce the rose oxide compounds. So pretty unique flavor, which really is a feature of Gewürztraminer wines. Let's do a small demonstration how we can bring out some other aroma compounds. A trick that I like to use the palm of your hand, cover the glass that you're using with your hand, swirl for a couple of seconds, and then release your hand. And at the same time, take a long, deep sniff. Try that with some of the aromas that we're trying today. You might that some pop out a bit more. For now, we're going to get rid of, sorry, before we do that, let's mix them. Almost forgot about that. So blend in your samples 5 and 6, and then give that a sniff, because these commonly occur in Gewürztraminer and Muscat at the same time. So that's a bit more of a realistic representation of that varietal character. Now let's, while we've dumped these, let's go ahead and pour sample number 7. You can leave 1 glass empty for now. We're just gonna try number 7. Just still compare it with the reference glass. I think you should have that on you still. Perfect. This is the aroma of butter caused by a compound called diacetyl. And if you put this one in your mouth, you will also notice a certain slickness. It's almost as if the mouthfeel is affected by this flavor compound. So that's another way that you can potentially detect this. There's some other descriptors here as well, popcorn as well as cookie dough. I put specific anosmia there as well, which is a scientific term for being blind to certain aroma compounds. And we know that in about 8% of the population, you see a very low sensitivity to diacetyl. So that means that you're unable to pick up that aroma compound. And in this particular tasting, the reference wine would appear exactly the same as sample number 7 to you. So that is a bit more common for this compound than other compounds. So all compounds have their own specific anosmia rate. So that's something that's inherited. You're either sensitive to flavors or you aren't. So it's mostly genetically determined. Diacetyl is produced during a process called malolactic fermentation. And that is an optional step in the production of white wines, where we are doing a conversion of malic acid into lactic acid. Malic acid is always found in grapes, in the pulp, and it contributes to acidity in white wines. If you choose to do that conversion into lactic acid, the result is a much lower acidity overall. So that is because lactic acid is a much weaker acid than malic. So you're reducing the acidity here, which is useful if you're dealing with grapes that have higher than desired acidity, perhaps due to climatic conditions or for other stylistic reasons. Maybe you don't want that sharp acidity, maybe you want a slightly softer style. This is a process that is being carried out by a specific set of bacteria called lactic acid bacteria. And we know that these are also capable of producing this compound called diacetyl. Yeast is actually also able to produce a compound which can turn into diacetyl, but never really at noticeable levels. So whenever you smell butter in wine, it's always a sign of malolactic fermentation. Not in all cases of malolactic fermentation is the diacetyl flavor noticeable. And let me give you 2 examples of that. So choosing a particular bacterial strain and using co-inoculation. Similarly to a wide variety of yeast types that exist on the market, you can also choose your own bacterial strain with known properties. And we know that some strains produce high levels of diacetyl and some produce very low levels. So in theory, you can have the malolactic fermentation being carried out by bacteria that produce lactic acid, but no diacetyl. Okay? If you have the malolactic fermentation being carried out by ambient microbes, so relying on a spontaneous malolactic, then you don't know how much butter you're going to get, how much diacetyl, so it's a little bit less predictable. Let me focus on the technique of co-inoculation, which basically means that normal fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, and the malolactic fermentation are being carried out at the same time. Now, traditionally, these happen sequential. So first you have normal, and then you have malolactic fermentation. In the case of inoculation, I'm going to show a study carried out by Lalamant, which is one of the leading producers and suppliers of yeasts and bacteria. During co-inoculation, yeast metabolizes the diacetyl produced by bacteria. In other words, it's cleaning up the butter flavor that bacteria produce. And on the left, you see a result of a co-inoculation. So very little levels of diacetyl when those two processes happen at the same time. And on the right is a more classic result of when alcoholic happens first and followed by malolactic. Then you see about 1 milligram per liter of diacetyl. And that is also the same level that I've added in this glass, number 7. So this is pretty representative of a normal result of malolactic fermentation. We know that this is a popular technique with some premium Chardonnay, and mostly because Chardonnay doesn't have that much flavor by itself, so it's not necessarily a grape that has much varietal character, and that makes it very suitable for using so-called winemaking techniques. And in the case of white wines, the winemaking techniques are malolactic, oak aging, as well as lees, excuse me, lees aging. What I missed with explaining about the co-inoculation, you might ask yourself, why would you do that in the first place? It's usually to save time, because the malolactic fermentation is actually quite a costly process, because you're adding more weeks onto basically when you can release your wine. So it's also an economic choice to choose co-inoculation. Right, we're going to move on. Empty your glass number 7. Should be 2 free empty glasses now. Pour your number 8 and 9, please. And then we're going to move on. We've arrived at the so-called secondary flavors. So those are always formed after fermentation. Remember, the primary is formed in the grape or during fermentation. But secondary are those flavors you see produced during winemaking techniques. And now we're looking at the flavor of vanilla. And vanilla is one of the key flavors released by oak. And the compound is conveniently called vanillin. Remember that those names are often coming from where it was first identified, and it was indeed identified in vanilla sticks. Ice cream is the common association here. Of course, it's often flavored with vanilla, so that explains that association. There's also clove and smoky. These are attributes that are caused by different compounds than vanilla, but have some structural similarity. So that means that these are both compounds that belong to the class of volatile phenols. And the same is true for cloves and smoky compounds. They are also volatile phenols, and they're structurally kind of related to vanilla. Vanilla isn't present in wood as such, but in wood you find a structural component called lignin. And when lignin is exposed to heat, then it turns into vanilla, and that vanilla can be extracted into the wine during oak aging. Now, that exposure to heat happens during a process of toasting, which means that basically a fire is lit inside the barrel. And this is a step that happens during the production, so the manufacturing of oak barrels. It's a compulsory step, so it always happens. There's some variation there, which I'll get back to. In general, there's a couple of factors that always determine the intensity of oak flavors in general, most notably whether that oak is going to be new. So newer oak gives up much more flavors, such as vanilla, compared with older oak, so an oak cask that has been used before. If you're using smaller oak casks, then typically the extraction is higher, because you're using you're looking at a higher proportion of oak versus liquid. And then we're going to talk about the wood origin as well. So whether that wood is coming from France, or whether that's coming from the United States. In other words, we're going to compare French oak versus American oak. And we know that in US, generally the growing conditions are a lot warmer than in France. And those warmer conditions result in a faster growing of the oak tree. And when an oak tree grows faster, the structure becomes much more porous. So you're getting like small segments of air inside your oak. And then if you oak age on that wood, the extraction is going to be a lot more efficient. Long story short, when you age on American oak, typically oak flavors in general are going to be higher because that extraction takes place much faster. On the other hand, in France, where the conditions are a bit cooler, you get a result. The result is much tighter grain, so much more compact type of wood, and that compact wood gives off less flavor. So it's a lot slower, even giving off those flavors, such as vanilla. Once again, Chardonnay, popular grape variety. Other varieties include Chenin Blanc, for example, that can see some oak. So there's also varieties such as Riesling that will never be oak aged, as well as Sauvignon Blanc. It simply would detract from the sort of more fresher floral qualities that you would hope to find in those varieties. As explained, this is a volatile phenol that can be detected by this phenolic ring that I'm showing here in the molecular structure. Okay, we're going to talk a bit more about oak. Let's skip this for now. I'm going to jump into sample number 9, so please smell that. And that is the smell of coconut, caused by a compound called whiskey lactone. And coconut, as well as its related alcoholic beverages such as pina colada or Malibu, are often what people find when they smell this particular sample. Dill is another interesting descriptor. You wouldn't think that these are related, but this is a compound found both in coconut as well as in dill. And it's named whiskey lactone because it was first identified in whiskey. And if you know anything about whiskey, you'll know that that is an oak aged spirit. So it always spends at least some years in oak. And it should make sense, therefore, that whiskey has some flavor properties or flavor similarities with an oak aged wine. And coconut flavor is interesting because it is present in much higher levels in American oak than any other type of oak. So this could be a clue as to where the origin of the flavor or where the origin of the oak was from, that coconut flavor. We know it's also related to some other factors, which I will pull out here in this nice study that was looking into concentrations of whiskey lactone. And in the top graph, you see different sources of oak from different forests. And then the most notable result here is on the right, you see American oak, which much higher levels of whiskey lactone compared with some of the forests in Europe. Bottom graph shows different levels of toasting of oak. And oak toasting can be compared to the toasting of coffee beans, where you have a light toast, medium toast, and a high toast or espresso toast. And we know that the lowest levels of coconut are shown here on the left, and this is a very light toast. So that means that during the production of oak barrels, that fire is lit to a much lower intensity and also of a longer time duration. Whereas if you toast to a higher degree, there's a medium plus toast, comparatively the coconut levels are lower. This is opposite to how the vanilla flavor develops. That means if you get a very light toast, vanilla levels will be quite low, and a high toast will result in higher levels of vanilla. So that's also an interesting variation here on the theme. We also know that vanilla levels are moderated by yeast. So we know that yeast can metabolize some of the vanilla flavors, and it doesn't do that with the coconut flavor. In other words, if you're barrel fermenting or you're aging a wine on the lees, then you're going to lose a little bit of that vanilla flavor, whereas the other oak flavors, such as coconut or cloves, remain intact. Let's mix these together and smell what could be an oak, a nice oak blend. So the vanilla and coconut flavors together really represent American oak. I get a little bit of a bourbon association here. Bourbon is a type of whiskey always made with new American oak, so you get lots of vanilla and coconut flavors. Interesting. Let's get rid of that and then fill up one of your glasses with the remaining sample of sample number 10. Give it a sniff, please. This is the smell of wet cardboard, which is indeed a very different category of flavors compared with the other 9 that we've tried. We're looking at an undesirable flavor here, so a wine fault. And this is indeed something that, that detracts from wine quality, and it's always an undesirable flavor. Wet cardboard being the one that resonates with about half of the wine tasters, followed by swimming pool. And the name of this compound is TCA, and the C is actually for chlorine or chloro. And that also explains that some people have a swimming pool link here, because well, these pools often contain chlorine compounds, and this is a chlorine-containing compound. Moldy also makes a lot of sense, because this is indeed a flavor produced by molds. Cork taint is the name of this fault, and that is the result of mold activity in natural corks. We know that this is a problem in about 1 in 100 bottles fitted with a cork, so excluding those fitted with a screw cap, for example. That chlorine from that molecule is actually derived from the growing environment of cork trees. Chlorine is a common component in all sorts of herbicides and pesticides that are used while growing cork trees. That contaminates the soil. Subsequently, the cork trees pull up the chlorine components via the roots. Those chlorine components then react with certain components in the tree to form a compound called TCP. And TCP is converted to TCA by molds. So that's a fairly long chain, but that is ultimately where this flavor comes from. And therefore, you could even draw the conclusion that this is largely a man-made flavor. So without intervention of humans, you wouldn't really get that wet cardboard flavor in your wines at all. It's directly the result of how we treat the cork trees. And also back in the day, they used chlorine as a bleaching agent to get to produce corks out of that cork bark. So especially in the 80s and 90s, the incidence was even higher of cork taint. You would be looking at about 8 to 100 bottles. Different solutions to this very effectively. If you use screw caps instead of corks as a producer, you reduce the chance of cork taint massively. So that's one of the main advantages of using a screw cap, other than maybe its convenience of opening the bottle. There's also some ways of removing TCA if it happens to wine. Famously, there's the cling film method, which basically means if you expose a wine to certain types of plastic from the type PVPP, then some of that TCA will be absorbed by the plastic. Kind of a questionable method, because you will also get some plastic flavors in your wine, and you might also be stripping the wine from some other potentially positive characters. So it's not a very effective way, but it remains an interesting demonstration. So I thought I'd illustrate the wine fault here as well. I also do sessions with wine faults only, so that means you're trying 10 undesirable flavors that are related to wine faults. So I thought I'd reveal, or I would give a small sample of what such a session would look like. Particularly low detection threshold, so most of us are very sensitive to this flavor. That brings us to a small ending of this presentation. If you're interested in the PowerPoint slides, please drop me an email on this email address. More than happy to send you the deck of slides. If you are interested in learning more, I post weekly on my Instagram channel using videos and posts if you want to further geek out on flavor compounds. More events like these. I also have a red wine flavors webinar scheduled on the 2nd of December 2024. So please do sign up if you want to continue more. Here's the link to my web shop where you can order tasting kits. And there's also an information booklet about the 10 flavors that we've tried today. It's about 30 pages long, so very in-depth detail about all these 10 flavors. I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope to see you at a future session, be that an in-person session or another webinar. Wish you all the best. Cheers.